Hi, my name is Dr. Debs, and this is my humble attempt at a medical analysis of the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ. Come with me. I present JC, a 33-year-old male, unmarried carpenter and rabbi who resides at Nazareth in Galilee and hails from the tribe of Judah. He presented today on account of massive torrential bleeding from multiple body lacerations, generalized body weakness, and altered state of consciousness of 6 hours duration. History was obtained from informants who happened to be eyewitnesses on the site of the scene. He was in his usual state of health until about 6 hours ago when he was said to be arrested by certain armed men at a place named Mount Olives for some unknown reason. He was subsequently beaten and battered brutally on his back. His neck is trunked, his limbs all over his body with certain metal whips that were designed with broken pieces of iron, glass, animal bone, and teeth. He was subsequently subjected to the burden of bearing a very heavy cross across his shoulders. Estimated weight was about 125 pounds, which he was later nailed to with nails about 15 cm long in both hands and feet. Positive history of sweating of blood of about 50 mils 12 hours ago. History is, however, also significant of extreme exhaustion and fatigue, malaise, anorexia, altered state of consciousness, and generalized body weakness, including transient fainting attacks when he fell on the way to a place called Calvary. He also had a crown of thorns plunged into his scalp, and he has had nothing to eat or to drink. The last thing he was heard saying was, "I thirst." There is also a positive history of significant psychological torture, evidenced by the fact that he was stripped naked, stark naked, beaten, mocked, jested, jeered, embarrassed, and publicly disgraced before the whole city. Social history is significant for going about, doing good, healing the sick, raising the dead, and delivering all who have been oppressed by the devil. He had no past medical history and is ruled to be the Son of God. On examination, he is a young man, critically ill-looking. Glasgow Coma scale is 8/15. He is in obvious, severe, painful distress and intense agony. Pain score is 10/10. He is pale, febrile, anitheric, cyanosed, and severely dehydrated. Mouth, tongue, and buccal mucosa are extremely dry. Eyes are sunken. Capillary review time is about 4 seconds, and skin to gold returns very slowly. There are deep, well-circumscribed indentations of nails seen on both hands and feet. On cardiovascular examination, patient is hypotensive. Blood pressure is almost unrecordable. Pulses are however noted to be weak, feeble, threatening,
the irregular and small volume. Sounds at distance and heavy murmur is heard. On respiratory examination, patient is seen to be dizzy, tachypnic with deep labored breathing. SpO2 is 75% in room air, breath sounds and bronchial with widespread quasi crepitations. Musculoskeletal examination is notable for multiple actively bleeding, deep skin lacerations extending from the face to the trunk to the back and both lower limbs. Also, there are deep, fully penetrated puncture wounds seen on both wrists and the ankle. Assessment: Class 4 shock. Mixed hypovolemic, cardiogenic, neurogenic, and distributive shock with multiple soft tissue injuries secondary to severe torture and battery, complicated by acute cardiopulmonary failure. Keep in view broken heart syndrome, aka Charcot tubal cardiomyopathy.
You paid the price for my salvation. You gave your life to set me free. The weight of my sin, God, you carried for me. The burden of my iniquities, you took it all from me.
This is a medical analysis of the suffering, the death, the crucifixion of Jesus. It is, however, worthy to note that Jesus Christ would have been in an excellent state of health and optimal physical condition, as evidenced by number 1, his occupation. Scriptures record that he was a carpenter, so hard labor would not have been a problem for him. Also, number 2, his ministry. Scriptures also record that he spent most of the time walking from city to city, preaching the gospel, healing the sick, and delivering all who were oppressed by the enemy. So, his vitality, his strength, and his stamina could not be questioned. However, for such a man in good and excellent physical condition to be exerted with so much torture and battery, we can imagine the gravity of all that he went through for us. The horror, the terror, the torture, the gruesomeness, hideousness, and ghastliness, the cruelty, the brutality, and barbarity of all that Jesus went through for us is way beyond what mere words can explain. However, this is just a meager attempt to open our eyes to see just a tiny little teeny bit, a little fragment of just what our Lord Jesus Christ went through for us. This analysis will be presented in the following sections. Number 1, the grief of Gethsemane. Number 2, the suffering of the scourge. Number 3, the gruesome road to Golgotha. And number 4, the crucifixion ordeal of Calvary. And these things took place that the scriptures may be fulfilled. It is important to recall that the suffering of Jesus did not just start when he was arrested or when he went to Calvary, but it started at Gethsemane. Scriptures record in the book of Luke 22 and 44 that, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became, watch this, like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. This phenomenon, in medical terms, is what we refer to as hematidrosis. Hematidrosis, sweaty blood. It's a very rare condition, but it is usually seen in periods of high or intense emotional agony and distress. And this is very significant and profound because this is what Jesus was going through at this time. So there was
was a lot of psychological anguish. Jesus was in so much distress. He was picturing what he was going to go through, the gory and horrific experience that he was going to be subjected to. And he was so anguished. And it was obvious. And this was what made, and what's this hematidrosis? Basically, it's when the capillaries under the skin, because of the intense agony or emotional distress, start to burst or rupture, and then they mix with sweat in the sweat gland. So when the person is sweating, the person is not just sweating the clear sweaty fluid, but the person starts sweating with sweat in form of the fluid. Yes, Jesus was in intense agony, evidenced by the fact that he had insomnia, he had not slept. He was so distressed that he just kept praying. He was even asking the disciples to watch with him, and we know what happened. They were even sleeping and they couldn't watch with him. He needed that support, he needed that emotional support, he needed that moral support. But his disciples could not even provide it. So Jesus was already in some form of isolation, and this is significant because he would be the one who would be isolated and who would be disdained and whose face God would turn away from, so that we can be accepted and reconciled to the Lord. Is also significant because he had also traveled a lot of miles from all the places he had been preaching and teaching from before he got to that place where he was arrested and subsequently crucified. The scourge, the suffering of the scourge. The scourge was a brutal punishment. It was a standard tradition of the Romans right before crucifixion or the execution of a criminal. The criminal would be publicly stripped naked and then tied to an upright pillar or post so that his back would be properly exposed for the whipping, and then he would be beaten until his flesh hung in shreds. The record of Jesus' scourge is seen in the book of Matthew chapter 27 and verse 26, which says, "Then they released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." Also found in the book of John chapter 19 verse 1. "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him." Now, it is important to note that the brutal part of the scourge was the special whip that was specially and specifically designed for vicious beating. It was designed by the Romans for vicious and brutal beating and torture of the criminal. Now, let's quickly look at the structure of the Roman whip. It was made up of 3 whips in one, with tiny pieces of iron, broken glass, and animal teeth and bone attached at intervals on this whip, so that when it is used on the victim, it will latch and attach to the flesh and then catch, so that when they drag it back, it's going to drag and pull back the flesh of the victim in long thin stripes. Indeed, it made a bloody pulp of a man's body. Can you imagine what Jesus went through? This was what Prophet Isaiah described in the book of Isaiah 53 and verse 5, which says that he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes. Do you see? The stripes is not just the whipping, but the stripes that the whip made of his back and his flesh was what Isaiah was describing. Indeed, his back was in bleeding stripes as he was whipped by the soldiers with no mercy at all. Now, what would have been the medical effect of
the Roman whip. Number one, the metal balls would have formed contusions. Contusions are basically small blood-filled sacs under Jesus' skin, because when the whips land on his body, it would just cause some tiny rupture of the blood vessels under the skin and form what we call contusions in medical terms. Number two, the pieces of iron and glass, they would cause multiple jagged, rugged, zigzag cuts along Jesus' back, body, trunk, and all his flesh. Then it will now drag it out again and bring out the flesh in stripe. Animal bones would cause multiple stripe-like lacerations, and the aim was to weaken the victim to a state just short of collapse or death. Some people may not have even survived the scourge, but Jesus did, because he was going somewhere. He was still going to the cross. Now, onto the number of strokes. There was no maximum number of strokes that the victim would be subjected to. However, the whipping could go on and on until the people or the soldiers inflicting the whipping decided it was deemed fit for it to be as long as possible. However, history records that Jesus was given 39 strokes of the whip. Now, remember that the whip is made up of 3 tongues. So one whip is made up of 3 tongues. So 3 tongues with the same animal bone and feet attached at intervals alongside the whip, and that would have given a total number of strokes of 39 times 3. If you check your calculator, 39 times 3 is 117. So Jesus received a total of 117 strokes of that brutal whip. This was what was prophesied by prophet Isaiah in the book of Isaiah 50 verse 6, where he said, I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plunged out my beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. So by flogging alone, Jesus Christ was already in very critical condition. After the scourge, the soldiers led Jesus away from Pontius Pilate and led him to the road, or to Golgotha. 3 major things happened. The first thing was that they stripped him naked. Number 2, they spat on him, they mocked him, and then they clothed him in purple garment or a purple robe, and then they twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head and started mocking him and saying, oh, King of the Jews, hail King of the Jews. They were mocking him, they were jesting, so much psychological torture. They started to mock him, laugh at him, jest at him, jeer at him, taunt him, jest at his helplessness. They treated him like trash, they spat on him, they ate his head. What did they not do to my Jesus? Now, let's talk about the crown of thorns. This crown of thorns was speculated or postulated to have been made because there were a lot of thorn trees around Golgotha. So they just thought that because somebody was just trying to invent a creative way to mock him and jest him, so it was not even a form of reverence or respect, it was a form of mockery, and just to torment and taunt him the more, person just probably grabbed a long stripe of thorns, made it into a crown, just turned it round, and then rammed it into his scalp. And one thing you must know about the scalp is a highly vascularized and innervated area of the body. And what do I mean by vascularized? It has a lot of blood vessels, a lot of veins and arteries, and it also has a lot of nerves, and nerves carry sensation of pain. So you can just imagine when they scrambled it into his scalp, and then you can imagine the sensation of intense shock and the jolt of pain that would just drive and course through Jesus' body, coupled with what he was already feeling from the beating and the whipping that happened at the scourge. Now let's talk about the cross. Although the Romans did not invent crucifixion, but one thing they did, they perfected it as a way of giving extreme torture and capital punishment designed to produce a slow death with maximum amount of pain and suffering. It was one of the most disgraceful and cruel methods of execution that was reserved for the vilest of criminals. Now, the cross was characterized by an upright post and an horizontal crossbar. Now, since the entire cross was going to be weighing about 136 kilograms, my goodness, it was only the horizontal bar that the victim was allowed to carry. Well, this horizontal crossbar is about 125 pounds, which is about 57 kg of wood and weight. And you can only imagine that Jesus was made to carry this over his shoulders, and this will not just be impinging on the nerves and the muscles and on his neck, but also rubbing against the already inflicted wounds on his back. Such agony, such cruelty, such brutality that he went through. Now, let's talk about the crucifixion ordeal of Calvary. Now, for them to have nailed Jesus to the cross, they would have probably threw him on the ground, and that alone would have caused all the lacerations and all the wounds on his back to be abrased again on the floor, on the hard, rocky ground, and then they would stretch his arms out wide so that he can kneel to the cross. Now let's talk about the nails. The nails were about 15 to 18 cm long. Now I want you to picture that. 15 to 18 cm long, and the weight was about 3 to 5 cm. It was very, very, very brutal for them to use such thing to nail and you can imagine, because they wouldn't have been able to nail him on the palm, because if they nailed him on the palm, because the palm is very flexible, it should have been easy for the hands to give, and then he probably would not have been able to stay glued to the cross, but they had to nail him in the wrist. Now the wrist is very special because it has a lot of bones. We call them the metacarpals, or sorry, we call them the carpal bones. Now the carpal bones, they're small bones arranged in a particular order, so they would have driven the nails directly through this wrist. And this wrist is also very important because there are so many important blood vessels and nerves. One of the important nerves is the median nerve. Now the median nerve is one of the nerves that supplies or gives innervation or gives sensation to the arm. So as they drove the nail into his arm, he would feel the sensation of pain course through his entire arm, and this would even worsen the agony and the pain that he was feeling at that moment. Now there's also the radial artery and other arteries and other blood vessels there. It should have also caused more bleeding because of the effects of the nail plunging into his wrist. Now this would have also happened on his legs, because they would have had to hit the nail deep so that it would stay glued to the cross. Now, the crucial effect of crucifixion, that was probably because they've been doing it over time, the Roman soldiers had already perfected the art, so they knew that one of the important ways that it was going to kill the victim was to interfere with respiration. Now, I want you to take a quick practical with me. I want you to breathe in and then breathe out. You can see that you are not just using your lungs or your nose to do the breathing process, you're also using some muscles which we call in medicine the accessory muscles of respiration, including your diaphragm, which is important for you to breathe in and breathe out. Now I'm going to try to be as layman as possible. Now for Jesus to inhale once on the cross, now note that he was not just on the cross with his arms like this. His arms were outstretched. You can just do this thing with me so that we can see, we can actually try and have a glimpse of how he suffered. So for him to breathe in or to inhale, he would have to pull against the nails of his hands and then push down on the ones of his feet like I'm breathing in. And that feeling, he would have to also take that same deep pushing against his feet and then pulling on his hand to breathe out. It would have been agonizing. It would have been so full of anguish. I cannot even. Oh, Jesus. And this maneuver will cause another bolt of searing pain to course through his entire body, and then the scraping of it. This maneuver will also allow his back that was already scorched and bleeding in shreds to scrape, and there will be an abrasion again against the back of the wooden cross, and it would just have been so terrible. Jesus is at the peak, is at the height of maximum agony, pain, anguish, and suffering. He's barely getting oxygen into his lungs. He's barely getting oxygen into his lungs. He's barely getting oxygen into his tissues, into his muscles. There's a lot of lactic acid build up in his muscles because everything is here. He has not eaten. He's probably suffering from hypoglycemia. So many things. He has lost so much blood already at this point. Everything looks bad from this moment. Now, the proposed causes of Jesus' death medically are said to be multifactorial. That means they could have been from different causes, and I'm going to be highlighting some of them for you. The first one is hypovolemia. Now, what is hypovolemia? Hypovolemia is simply reduced blood volume. Now, because of the marked blood loss that Jesus had he had not had food or water since Thursday night, 6 p.m. on Thursday night to 3 p.m. on Friday. That's about 21 hours without food or water. It was even recorded in John 19:28 that he said, "I thirst." And this would have caused a marked level of dehydration, and this would have contributed to the hypovolemia, which would have led to hypovolemic shock. The second proposed cause of Jesus' death would have been the marked blood loss, so what we call hemorrhage. Now, Jesus had been bleeding for a long time, even before the scourge or anything started. From Gethsemane, the Bible records that he was sweating blood, which I described previously as hematidrosis. He had already been bleeding, sweating blood loss, some amount of blood in that situation. The second thing would have been the 39 times that he was flogged, that he was whipped, seriously battered and bruised. And the third thing would have been the crown of thorns that would have also caused a lot of blood loss from his scalp. Like I said, the scalp is very, very rich in blood vessels, and also the slapping, the beating, the hitting, everything would have caused a lot of blood loss in Jesus. And this was enough to cause hemorrhagic shock. Now, the third thing would have been the poor oxygen delivery. Already I described to us the process and the maneuver that Jesus would have had to create for him to actually be able to breathe in and breathe out whilst being suspended on that brutal cross. And this would have caused a little amount of oxygen to be delivered to his lungs and even his tissues, so there will be development of lactic acid in his muscles and all that, and that alone would have caused a lot of respiratory failure. Now, the fourth next proposed cause of Jesus' death would have been what I call septic shock. Now, what is sepsis? Sepsis is basically a widespread life-threatening organ dysfunction due to the fact that the body cannot respond well to infection. And you're asking me, infection how? Yes, remember the news. Remember the beatings that would have exposed the skin, because the skin is supposed to be a barrier that prevents infection from getting into the internal structures of the body. So the fact that this has been exposed would have put him or made him prone to infection. What about the animal teeth and bones and all that were made from the whips? And I'm sure they did not clean the whips, so you can only imagine how exposed he was or how vulnerable his body was already to infection. But this would have caused widespread sepsis and septic shock. The fifth proposed cause of Jesus' death would have been neurogenic shock. Now, this would have been particularly due to the fact that he had been experiencing a massive and a marked amount of intense excruciating pain. His blood pressure would have fallen very low by now, and again the signals and the neural pathways in his body would have been so dysregulated because of the searing and jolting grips of pain that he was experiencing. Now, this was confirmed in the book of Psalm 21 from verse 16 to 21. The proposed cause of Jesus' death would have been psychological shock. Now, Jesus had already started experiencing a high level of emotional anguish from Gethsemane. That was already 21 hours ago when he was sweating blood and was in deep anguish, as the Bible recorded in Luke chapter 22 verse 44. Now, coupled with the fact that all through the road to Gethsemane, to Golgotha, he was mocked, he was lied against, false witnesses arose. I mean, these were people that he helped, these were people that he healed, these were people that he saved and delivered, these were people that he raised their dead, these were people that he healed their paralytics, these were people that he set their captives free, and they were mocking him, they were lying against him, they were bringing false witnesses to say things he did not say, to say that he said he was going to do things that he did not say he was going to do. All these things, all he just wanted was to bring hope and to bring life, and all this would have caused a high level of psychological shock. Even the Bible records it in the book of Psalm 69 verse 20, Psalm 22 verse 14, and Zechariah 13 verse 6. Now, the final proposed cause of Jesus' death is what we call broken heart syndrome, which is also called stress-induced cardiomyopathy or Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Now, don't just forget about the big English, it's just stress-induced. Now, this is a special type of heart dysfunction that occurs due to a high level of acute or sudden stress on someone, and this would put a lot of pressure and workload on the heart muscles so that they stop pumping blood to the body like they should. And this would have been very, very possible in Jesus' case, medically speaking, because he was subjected to a high level of stress, emotional, physical, mental, psychological, every otherwise. And this would have caused this proposed cause to actually be a very, very possible cause of death in Jesus' case. I have attempted with my limited medical knowledge to try to explain all the suffering, the pain, and the torture that my Jesus and Christ, Lord and Savior, went through on the cross. But by no means can I deny, or can medicine, science, and whatever it is deny that if he did not want to die, no one would have been able to kill him. He said it in his word that I lay down my life and you do not take it from me. By all means, accept these theories and postulations as theories and postulations, but never forget, always remember that not for 1 second was his divinity separated from his humanity. He was even 10 times more powerful on the cross, like he was when he was not on the cross.
My medical analysis is so limited because how, honestly, can I even begin to explain the death of my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? It's almost impossible. And I just tried.
He did not just die. He did not just die. He suffered. He suffered. He suffered. Then he died. He laid down his life. Just. But the story does not end. But the story does not end there. Because what happens next will change.